Hi, and welcome back to our APES classroom, where today we're learning about aquatic biomes. So we've talked about terrestrial biomes, the land biomes, and today we're talking about aquatic biomes. So we're going to learn the two main types of aquatic biomes, freshwater biomes and marine biomes, and we're going to talk about some characteristics of each and some characteristic ecosystems within each. So when we talk about characteristics of aquatic biomes, they're shaped by four main factors. And the number one characteristic is the salinity. So salinity is really just how much salt there is in a body of water. And that determines which species can survive, as well as whether or not we can drink that water. So we kind of have three main categories. Those would be freshwater, brackish, or usually found in estuaries, and ocean. So we have three different levels of salinity. The second characteristic of an aquatic biome is its depth, and depth influences how much sunlight can penetrate and reach plants or any photosynthesizers. And so deeper aquatic biomes are going to have very different characteristics from shallower aquatic biomes, as well as different organisms. And then flow. So what we're talking about is how fast the water is moving. And that really determines which plants and organisms can survive, largely because it determines how much oxygen is dissolved in the water. And then, of course, temperature. Warmer water holds less dissolved oxygen, so it can support fewer aquatic organisms. All the aquatic organisms depend on dissolved oxygen in the water in order to be able to breathe. So let's start with our freshwater aquatic biomes. Those would be rivers and lakes. Within rivers, of course, we can also talk about streams. So rivers and streams tend to have high oxygen levels, high dissolved oxygen levels, because the flow mixes water and air. They tend to be cool, especially near their sources. Rivers particularly can also carry lots of nutrient-rich sediments, which when it is deposited, especially in seasonal flooding in those deltas and those floodplains, that can result in very fertile soil. Lakes, of course, are standing bodies of fresh water. These are a key drinking water source for many people around the world. Lakes, we're going to talk about different zones of the lake. So we have the littoral zone, which is shallow water. This is where you'll see plants who have their roots in the soil underneath the surface of the water, but the plants themselves emerge from the shoreline or are above the water. So our limnetic zone is not rooted plants, it's phytoplankton, but it's still where light can reach. So we still have photosynthesizers. So these would be algae, any little grasses that might be growing but not rooted. Those tend to be in the littoral zone. And then we have the profundal zone. Not all lakes have a profundal zone, but if you have a large, deep lake like the Great Lakes, you may have a profundal zone, and that zone is too deep for sunlight to reach. So there's no photosynthesis occurring in that zone. And then all lakes, whether they have a profundal zone or not, have a benthic zone. And the benthic zone is really just that where the water meets the bottom of the lake. So it's the murky bottom part of the lake where invertebrates tend to live. That's bugs, that's crayfish, anything like that. And they have very nutrient-rich sediments. We also have freshwater wetlands. And a wetland is an area where the soil is submerged or saturated in water for at least part of the year, but it's shallow enough for emergent plants. So this means that we have rooted plants growing in there and emerging above the water line. The plants that live there have to be adapted to living with their roots submerged in standing water. Not everything can live with its roots submerged in standing water. And so, again, very unique adaptations and characteristics. So these are things like cattails or lily pads or reeds or bald cypress. Wetlands have a lot of benefits, and a lot of those benefits are financial benefits, economic benefits. Wetlands store excess water during storms. That tends to decrease the severity of flooding. They recharge groundwater because by holding water for a long time, they allow the rainfall to absorb into the soil rather than simply running off into surface water. The roots of the wetland plants filter pollutants from the water as it drains through the wetlands and into the groundwater system. And they tend to have very high plant growth because they have lots of water and nutrients in the sediments. So 3 main types of freshwater wetlands. The first one here is a swamp. These should be very familiar to us here in this area. You see the bald cypress here. Swamps are characterized by high levels of tannins. That's why their water tends to be kind of black or a very dark brown color. They have enough soil to support woody plants like bald cypresses, trees, and they do tend to be covered in water year round. Okay. Then we also have marshlands. Marshlands may or may not be covered in water year round. And they tend to be filled with reeds and grasses. You also see lily pads in this particular image. And so the water level in a marsh tends to be more changeable than the water level in a swamp. And then our last type of freshwater wetlands is what we call a bog. And a bog tends to be characterized by kind of mats of vegetation that will eventually cover the whole surface of the bog. It tends to be very low in oxygen, which then means that it tends to be acidic because of the decomposition that's occurring under the surface. And so very often this is where peat forms. And as we talk about energy sources later on, we'll talk about peat and the formation in anaerobic acidic conditions. So we tend to have spruce trees at the edge and sphagnum moss in bogs. Okay, so moving from freshwater aquatic biomes into saltwater aquatic biomes, we're going to go through estuaries. So estuaries are areas where rivers empty into the ocean or where bays empty into the ocean. They are characterized by a mixture of fresh and salt water, so brackish water. And you have species that are uniquely adapted to that mix of fresh and salt water, both plants and animals. Estuaries are one of the highest productivity biomes. They have lots and lots of plant growth, lots and lots of algal growth, lots and lots of photosynthesizers and consumers, because you have so many nutrients in the sediments that are deposited in those estuaries by the rivers. All of the sediment that travels down the river gets deposited in the estuary before it empties into a bay or an ocean. So salt marsh is one of our estuary habitats that's very common here. These should look very familiar to you. They are a breeding ground. They are a nursery for many fish and shellfish species. And so we have lots and lots of salt marshes in our area. We're in a temperate climate. Going farther south into a tropical climate, this is estuary habitats along the coast of tropical climates, we tend to get mangrove swamps. And the mangrove is a tree which has long stilt-like roots, and those roots stabilize the shoreline. They provide habitat for lots of species of fish and shellfish. You can see how as the roots come down into the water, there are lots of little hiding places and nooks and crannies for the animals, but these roots also help to stabilize the shoreline. Okay, moving from estuaries and brackish water habitats out into the ocean, we're going to encounter coral reefs. So coral reefs tend to occur in warm, shallow waters beyond the shoreline. They are considered to be the most diverse marine biome on Earth. You have a mutualistic relationship here between the coral, which are the animals, and the algae, which are the plants that live within the corals. The corals take the carbon dioxide out of the ocean, create calcium carbonate for their exoskeleton, and they also provide carbon dioxide to the algae for their photosynthesis. The algae live within those exoskeletons, and they provide energy to the coral through their photosynthetic processes. Both species rely on the other. The coral couldn't survive without the energy from the algae, and the algae need the habitat that is provided by the coral, as well as the carbon dioxide that's provided by the coral. In addition, the coral reef provides a habitat for hundreds of thousands of species of fish and shellfish and other marine animals. It is the foundation of many, many food chains and food webs in the ocean. Backing towards the shore just a little bit from the coral reef, we have this zone called the Intertidal Zone. So the Intertidal Zone is this narrow band of coastline that exists between high tide and low tide. And so here we have mostly sandy shores. Other areas you may find rocky shores. And so you do tend to have a little bit more life in rocky shoreline intertidal zones, but we also have a lot of life in our intertidal zones. Organisms that live in these intertidal zones have to be adapted to survive, whether there is water over them at high tide or no water over them at low tide. So they have to be able to survive the waves. They also have to be able to survive the direct sunlight and heat and dry conditions during low tide. So you'll see lots of barnacles, sea stars, crabs that can attach themselves. If you think about the intertidal zone here, you'll see lots of fiddler crabs, other crabs, barnacles. Think about what you see on the pilings of piers and docks, as well as in the marsh grasses. Most of the animals in the intertidal zone have shells or a tough outer skin that helps prevent them from drying out during low tide. There are also some organisms that are adapted to go into the intertidal zone to hunt for prey during low tide in those tide pools. So different organisms are adapted to live in different zones. You may even have some that live only in the high tide zone, only in the low tide zone, in the splash zone, but they have unique adaptations that allow them to live in those different zones. So if you look at, there's a type of seaweed called spiral rack. It curls itself up and it actually secretes a sort of a mucus that helps to protect it and allow it to retain water during low tide. If you go out to the beach, you'll find that there are a lot of little cochlea that dig into the sand, and so they come up when there is water washing over them, and then they go back down into the sand to stay wet when there's not water washing over them. Okay, our last zone then that we need to talk about as far as a marine biome is the open ocean. So the open ocean is actually considered to be a very low productivity zone. We're going to talk more about productivity, but it really is how much carbon dioxide can be processed in per unit area, because the only thing that lives really in the open ocean is algae and phytoplankton. Now, that said, although it is a low productivity per unit area, the ocean is so enormous that there are so many algae and phytoplankton that they actually produce the vast majority of the Earth's oxygen and absorb a huge amount of atmospheric carbon dioxide. So although it's considered to be a low productivity zone, that's per unit area. Because it has such a large area, it is highly productive. Okay, so like the lake, the ocean has zones. We have the photic zone, which is the area that sunlight can reach. This is the area where photosynthesis can occur, and it's within about 200 meters of the surface of the ocean. Below that, we have the aphotic or the abyssal zone of the ocean, and that area is too deep for sunlight to reach. In the aphotic zone, we have some really unique creatures. You guys might be familiar with the anglerfish, if for no other reason than he was a major character in, or at least a significant minor character in Finding Nemo. So this area is too deep for sunlight to reach. So you don't have photosynthesizers. You do have chemosynthesizers, things that are capable of producing energy from chemical processes. And you also have a lot of consumers that eat stuff that sinks down. Okay, and so that's it for today, and I look forward to hearing your questions tomorrow.